With just 3 days left in the election campaign, party leaders are spreading across the country in a final push to win the support of whatever undecided voters are left in this country. Here to discuss what's at stake for each of the leaders on Monday, we have the CBC's chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. Rosie, good to see you.
Thanks for having me in Adrian's studio.
we keep showing up in the weirdest places. You know, the clips we just heard there from the leaders, Poilievre is change. Carney is kind of Trump, and Singh and Blanchet are please. I mean, this is where we are in the end game. What's your sense of how this election is closing out?
Yeah, I have to say today what struck me was the mudslinging between the Bloc leader and the NDP leader. Like, it's so unusual to see that, like largely pointless in terms of why you would go after each other, but informative because I think it tells you where we're at. And that is at a place where, particularly for the two of them, no matter what they did through this campaign, they just could not punch into the psyche of voters. That's not to say people aren't voting for them. People are voting for them. But because of the way this has been such a binary kind of race, because of all the reasons we've talked about, just extraordinary, I thought, to see them both, to your point, plead for support. In almost kind of a desperate way, and taking pot shots at one another, even though they both may end up in deep trouble, and certainly aren't taking support from one another. Like, that's the other part that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that they have now resorted to their arguments of, you know, for the Bloc leader, if there is anything here, if there's anything you're worried about for Quebec, and him admitting, in his view, that Mr. Carney will form the government, then it is safe to return there.
Right.
And for Jagmeet Singh in his final days, frankly, to make an argument that he probably should have started with, and that is, if you want progressive policies, we can help you. And we also think the race is over. I mean, that's also extraordinary for two opposition leaders to come to a conclusion. And I know why they're saying it. It's a tactical reason. But for them to be saying so publicly they know what the outcome is, that's a pretty unusual development in what has been an unusual campaign.
Yeah, the little dust-up we saw between them today, you got a sort of a taste of that in the French language debate, right? When Mr. Singh looked at Mr. Blanchet and said, you are as useless as the monarchy in this minority, because he wants to use them as a contrast point. But like outside of Berthier, Masconanger, and Rosemont on the island of Montreal, they're just not fighting with each other, right? So it is the most presidentialized election, I feel like, I've certainly covered, you know, in that it is this binary choice with Carney and Poilievre going into the final weekend. And Carney seems to be on a more offensive tour in the final days with a little bit of defense and motivating for Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, and people wonder, well, how can you say that? You don't know what the outcome is. That's right, we don't.
No.
But parties are deciding where to go based on what their own internal polling is telling them. And so you can detect things from that, right? You see where Mr. Poilievre is, Saskatchewan. Sure, he hadn't been there yet. If you were really concerned, though, about trying to form government, I think you would take a pass and say, we know Saskatchewan likes us, we're good there, and you would go and hit some places that were more battle-rich. The fact that he is in Alberta, I think, is also a telling sign. I'm not saying he's going to lose people in Alberta. I'm just saying that he is reverting back to traditional bases of support for the Conservatives. And if that is where he is spending his time in these last days, that tells me that they aren't incredibly hopeful about things. And for Mr. Carney, yeah, you're right. You know, he was in Winnipeg and Leah Gazan's riding last night.
Following Jagmeet Singh because he wants his seats.
Yeah, he is going after any kind of orange seat he can. He is, as Chantal Hébert said at issue last night, hunting for that majority, that they are looking for ways to break through that 172 and see whether they can get it. I did have to take a minute. Yeah. And I think you can also see with the energy of that campaign that they think that they are on a good path as well. Like, he's going to now cover the country in the last couple of days and try and create a sense of energy and momentum to convince people that he has this. You know, the danger for the Liberals here, and there is a danger, is that people think that it's done, that it's won, even their own supporters, and that those supporters don't show up, don't show out, and that argument that the Bloc and the NDP are making, that does start to hold some weight for people. And so they do return to sort of their natural home base, voter base, and then everything gets upended again, right?
Yeah.
Because there are a few days left, and we don't know how many people are going to vote on Monday, and it could still change things. But in order for it to change dramatically, those numbers from the Bloc and the NDP have to come up, and I think we're just at a place right now where time is running out.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting as the results come in on Monday night. Like, we start obviously with Atlantic Canada, the polls close there first. That's a conservative liberal area, right? The New Democrats are probably not going to bust through there, and the Liberals will probably win a significant majority of the seats in Atlantic Canada. In terms of whether or not the complacency has set in, and whether the counter-arguments of Singh and Blanchet, we'll start seeing that in Montreal right away, southwestern Ontario, and across the prairies. But we may not know the final answer until British Columbia, just depending on how it goes, because that's where the NDP power base, such as it is, remains, right?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that struck me today and yesterday is Mr. Poilievre's argument around change. And again, change is the ultimate driver of voters. Like, if people are sick of a government, that's the thing that flips them. And again, that is not really where Mr. Poilievre started, right? He started by talking about some issues, but not punching that argument as hard as he could and as hard as he has in these last days. Maybe that'll make a difference for some people.
It's more about the fourth Liberal majority or mandate now, rather than Mark Carney's just like Justin Trudeau, when there's stylistic and quantitative differences.
Well, and also because that didn't seem to matter. That didn't seem to resonate with voters who have frankly moved on from Justin Trudeau and who are looking at different options now. So I don't know whether that change argument will penetrate into the electorate over the next few days, but it is still, I think, the strongest argument that the Conservatives have. And you're right, for Mr. Carney, it remains about President Trump. And anytime President Trump speaks, today in that Time magazine interview, it is, again, a galvanizing motivator for Mr. Carney and what he's putting on the table in terms of how to take it on. But you're right, it could be British Columbia this time that gives us a clearer picture of what the country wants.
I'm at risk of looking ahead past Monday. To talk about change. If the data is right, and if the trend lines continue, and it is a Mark Carney majority-led Liberal government, majority Liberal government, I mean, Jagmeet Singh, Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Poilievre, like, there is so much potential change. After Justin Trudeau quit on January 6th, we could be in a whole cycle of just change in national leadership and transformation that just will keep spilling out in the wake of all of this. Yeah,
I mean, the whole political landscape could be dramatically upended, either because parties don't do well, or because leaders decide that they can't continue, or their caucus decides they don't want them. This, as you and I have talked about so many times, the number of things that have triggered this cascade of events, it is not over. It is not over. You put aside who gets to form government on Monday night, Tuesday, all the other dominoes that are going to fall after that happens, I think, will be significant and fascinating in terms of how parties choose to rebuild themselves and reshape themselves based on what Canadians decide.
If you had scripted what has happened since Chrystia Freeland quit and what's going to happen, they would have kicked you out of the writer's room. It's unbelievable.
It would have been a really good HBO show.
We'll find out. All right, Rosie, big day Monday. This is CBC's chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, and she's going to lead our coverage as the CBC has you covered on Monday for election night. Here at Power in Politics, we're going to bring you special pre-election coverage right here from Toronto, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern. Then Rosie will host Canada Votes, and I'm going to join her as soon as I can get downstairs. Join us for minute-by-minute updates as polls close across the country. Coverage begins at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 Pacific, wherever you watch CBC News. We're going to look at the bigger picture now. We're going to as we head into the last weekend of this campaign, we're going to check in on the current state of the race, and for that, we're going to bring in our Éric Grenier. He is back, and he, of course, is the author of TheWrit.ca. He also runs the CBC Poll Tracker, which, Éric, I look at about 40 times a day, and based on the traffic I'm seeing, so do tens of thousands and maybe millions of other Canadians. So, look, when we checked in earlier this week, the top line was the Liberals had about a 5-point lead over the Conservatives nationally. What kind of movement are you seeing in those numbers this week?
We are seeing that the lead that the Liberals had earlier on in the campaign is definitely dissipated. They're still ahead, but the margin is now more about a 3 or 4 point lead. In the poll average on the poll tracker, it takes into account all the polls that are being published in this campaign. The Liberals are still leading. They have 42.3% support in the poll tracker. Conservatives are not too far behind now. They're at 38.6%, so it's not a very big gap. It's definitely a smaller one than we saw just before the debates when the Liberals were 6-7 points ahead. And for the other parties, the New Democrats are still struggling. They're at just under 9%. The Bloc Québécois has seen a little bit of a rebound in Quebec. They're at 6%, and the Greens still not really registering very much at 2%.
Okay, a little bit of a tightening in the top line, but still a Liberal lead, the type that would suggest that they're going to do pretty well. So, I mean, let's look at the seat projections here and what these new numbers tell us about where the parties stand.
Yeah, because of some of the numbers we've seen, particularly in Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, the Liberals are still favored to win the most seats and potentially majority government. We're currently projecting they would win 190 seats. Take a look at the range there. There's a lot of uncertainty in some of these races, particularly in Quebec, but the lower range for the Liberals is now 165. It used to be entirely above the majority threshold. Now it's a little bit below it. So there is still a scenario we can imagine if all those close races don't go the Liberals' way, that they could come up short. But the Conservatives are well behind at 125 seats, and they top out at 144, which is probably not enough to even form a minority government. Bloc Québécois still doing worse than they had in the last election at 22 seats, but it's between 19 and 26 seats, so we could still see that they get a decent haul. The NDP is at 5, but with a range of 3 to 13, so there's a lot of it's going to depend on the local candidates. And the Greens still at 1, still in contention for the 2 seats they had at dissolution.
Okay, I got a quick question to ask you just about those ranges. Éric, even at the low end of 165 for the Liberals, with the Conservatives at the high end of 144, there's no scenario we see right now with the polling where the Liberals actually finish behind the Conservatives. Is that safe to say, or how should we view it?
Yeah, that is pretty much it. The ranges take into account all the normal kind of errors you see.
Right.
We do have a wider range, which is if the polls are pretty much just very wrong. In that scenario, you do have the potential for the Conservatives to be ahead, but it would take something that would be pretty unprecedented.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so those are the top line numbers. The key thing, though, here is the regional numbers, right? So, because vote inefficiency and vote efficiency really matter. So let's look at how the parties are doing some of the battlegrounds. Let's start with Quebec, where the Liberals are far ahead, but the race between the Bloc and the Conservatives for second has been tight. So where do things stand now in Quebec?
Yeah, in Quebec, we still have the Liberals leading, but they have now dropped below 40%. Earlier on in the campaign, they were quite a bit above that threshold. So they have a lead of about 14 points over the Bloc Québécois. So they are in a good position to pick up a lot of seats from the Bloc. The two parties were more or less tied in Quebec in the 2021 election. Conservatives, though, are up pretty big in Quebec. 25% would be more than what Stephen Harper managed in that 2006 breakthrough. So the Conservatives could be actually taking some seats away from the Bloc. The NDP at 6%, still struggling in the province. But it's this gap between the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois. It used to be 20 points. Now it's at 14 points. That does make a difference in a lot of seats.
Okay, just before we leave Quebec, so Éric, the Liberals I speak with, they say if the number starts with a 4, if they get over 40, that's kind of where they need to be. You know, if they're on the path to a majority, they're just below 40%. Do they still maybe get over 40 seats, or is it in doubt?
Right now, we're projecting that they would win about 40 seats. So it seems to be in line with what the polls are telling you.
Okay, all right, Mark Carney, he left Quebec a couple of days ago. He's campaigning in Ontario today, where there are 122 seats up for grabs. Earlier in the week, Liberals had an 11-point lead there. How are the parties doing now in Canada's biggest province? Yeah, the Liberals still have a lead in Ontario, but it isn't as big as it was before. So currently we have them leading with 47.4%. The Conservatives are just under 40%. So now we're looking at a gap that's more 7 or 8 points between the Liberals and the Conservatives, which is still a pretty big gap. And if you put that gap up against the kind of margins that Justin Trudeau had when he won 78, 80 seats in elections in Ontario, this is a good result for the Liberals. The NDP at 8%, still struggling. And again, it really will come down to just their incumbents and whether they can survive. 8% for the NDP in Ontario, you should see most of them get wiped out. Maybe they have some local appeal that is going to save some of them. Yeah, they got those 3 incumbents in southwestern Ontario that they need to hold on. Okay, Pierre Poilievre spending his last Friday on the campaign in Western Canada, be at events in British Columbia this evening. Where does that race currently stand in BC? Because that's a key one for the Conservatives here. It is, and it is still one of the most fascinating provinces we've seen throughout this election. We do still have the Liberals leading in British Columbia on average with 42% support. The Conservatives are not very far behind. It's 39% they have, so that's about a 3-point gap in BC. It had been 5-6 points not too long ago. The NDP at 13%. Their numbers have come up a little bit, but still, more than half of their vote has gone away. And the Greens at 4% in BC. They usually do a lot better than that. Again, it is going to come down to, for both the New Democrats and the Greens, the name on the ballot, not the color of the party, because the color of the party is not helping out those candidates right now. Vancouver Island is the most fascinating little micro-region in the entire country, like all 4 colors you see on the board, skin in the game there. So Éric, what else are you watching for in the last weekend of the campaign?
Well, we are going to get that final rush of polls. The polling front got a little quiet the last few days as the pollsters are doing their last checks. So I'm going to look to see if we do see any last-minute movement. That is when we sometimes get a signal if there is going to be a surprise on Election Day. So just to see if any of those numbers are going to shift. But for people watching at home, they see lots of those polls coming out. You got to look at the Ontario numbers especially, because a lot of the national numbers we've seen, the margin has been getting tighter, but the Liberal lead in Ontario is still big enough that they should win, at the very least, 80 seats in Ontario if those numbers hold up.
Yeah, and Éric, just to explain to people why Ontario matters so much, it's 122 seats.
Big province.
It's Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, the 3 territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and BC combined. Right? That's why Ontario decides elections, right?
Yeah, and that's usually how Ontarians think of themselves, as just an accumulation of all those different provinces. But definitely, that's the ball game for the Liberals and for the Conservatives.
Yeah. That is a larger conversation that we're not going to have right now. But Éric, thank you so much. That's TheWrit.ca's Éric Grenier. We're going to check back in with Éric on Tuesday, the day after the election, as we pick over the numbers. Okay, we're going to go back to Fred and Greg and Cheryl. Cheryl, what do you make of those numbers, in particular the way BC is looking there? I find it fascinating because I think the Liberals got 3rd in vote share in BC in the last election, but like 2nd in seats, right? Because
most
of incredible most in seats. And Cheryl, here they are like at 42%. They've never seen numbers like that in BC in a long, long time. What do you make of what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen BC vote so volatile, not just through this federal election, but through the provincial election as well. Like we saw the Conservatives sitting ahead throughout the campaign provincially. You saw those numbers tied, and then eventually have David Eby come out just barely with a win. And in this election as well, a lot of people who had voted Conservative or New Democrat in the past have flocked to the Liberals as likely a stable choice. But a lot of volatility, and like you say, a lot of volatility on the island, where the NDP has been making a really specific push. And if you're out there and you see the lawn signs, the signs say only New Democrats, stop Conservatives, which I think Vancouver Island is the only place they're putting those signs up. But that seems to be resonating because the NDP vote is actually stronger in British Columbia than it is across the country. So, as you said, really, really interesting place to watch. And certainly, BC wrestles with some really difficult decisions, economy versus environment. And so not surprising to see the vote shake out this way.
So, Greg, when you look at those BC regional numbers, the Ontario numbers, and the Quebec numbers, how smugly overconfident are you as the Liberal in the room right now?
You know how I hate predictions, and I hate to fly too close to the sun. And 2 weeks ago, you made us walk through our predictions, and I just, kind of tensed all weekend for somebody to accuse me of drape measuring. But, when Éric was talking about Ontario, as the resident dinosaur on the panel today, I remember in '93 when, the Chrétien election, and when the numbers, started coming in for Ontario, Chrétien was just running the board. So, one of my, second, I guess, earliest federal election, and, really hits home what the impact of Ontario plus Quebec can be for the Liberal Party. So I think, I'm not unhappy that the Conservative leader is doing rallies this weekend, because it sends a message to Liberals that you need to get out there and continue to work until, the polls close. But also, I am mindful that when you do a rally, all those rallies that the Conservatives are doing, they are taking volunteers away from other things as well. So I think the lesson, for Liberals is to not listen to what you just described, how you described me. Don't be smug, and just floor it, gas pedal all the way.
Well, yeah, Fred, I tried to walk Greg into jinxing his party, but he didn't take the bait. So there you go. But look, Fred, when you look at numbers like that and you look at the time that's left, there has been some tightening, but it's like 1 or 2 points really at the top line. It's not been the big kind of move I think the Conservatives were hoping for. So, what is your sense of how it looks now and how much it could realistically change in the time that's left?
Yeah, look, in 21, we were leading in terms of seat count, we believed in our tracking on the Thursday, and by the Monday, that had fallen. So those 3 days did matter. So something could happen if they somehow catch fire with their message over the next 3 days, and where they're going. The numbers that are jumping out at me, though, like in Ontario, last election, Liberals beat us by 4 points, and they got 78 seats, and now they're beating us by 8 points. I don't know, like 80 is the number Grenier gave. That seems like it could be quite low. Quebec is another one. The Bloc, expected to win around 22 seats. They've never actually gotten in that range before. They're always way above 30 or under 10. So that's a wave province where things shift drastically. So I think the Bloc will either come back and win a lot of seats or will go much lower than 22. And of course, those unfortunately will likely go to the Liberals. There's a couple of seats Conservatives can pick up there, the Beauport region, maybe Trois-Rivières, but it's a tough place for us to grow.
Okay, one of the interesting things we've seen are the ads from the Conservatives in the stretch run, mostly targeted at older voters and older men. There's the golfing ad, there's the Stephen Harper direct appeal, there's a new one out. Let's take a look at the most recent ad the Conservatives are running.
I see people in grocery stores picking up products, looking at the price, putting them back.
The Liberals get back in, oh my gosh, I just signed my pension check over to the Liberal government. They'll have it all before I even get it.
One of my children left Canada for better employment opportunities.
Okay, there's a trend there, Cheryl, in who's in that ad. Older, white, and that maybe tells us who the Conservatives feel they need to get in the time that they have left. What do you make of that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's really telling. They're spending, I think we called it a really defensive campaign earlier today. They're spending their last days in places where they should have safe seats with ads targeting voters who should be a safe demographic. Like we saw white upper class male golfers. If the Conservatives don't have white upper class male golfers, I don't know who they have. And in this ad, like, yes, I imagine that this rings really true for the people watching the ad, but I also would think that the people who found themselves in this demographic would already be Conservative supporters. So I've said from the beginning, I am surprised by the Conservatives' ad strategy, always impressed by the ability for them to reach people online, but I do question the content, and I think it is really telling about their strategy in these final days.
Fred, what does that tell us? I mean, the golf ad, was obviously targeting men in this cohort, and now there's some women in this one, but it's very much a baby boomer play, because what I hear from candidates is that if it's a woman in particular over the age of 50, they're not getting a good response at the door.
Right, so I wouldn't say this is defensive play. This is actually an offensive play, trying to get that voter demographic back. We haven't had it since, we've lost it in 2015 and have never had it since then. That's 3 elections in a row where the Liberals have defeated us in a demographic that used to be very solid Conservative, and it isn't anymore. I do find it, a bit unfortunate that 3 days before Election Day, we're now putting out more aggressive ads, trying to win that over. We've had 2 years to do something on this, and we haven't. But that's one of the things we got to take away from this as Conservatives. We got to get better at figuring out the demographics we need to win and going after them much sooner than a few days before E-Day.
Greg, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think what's interesting is who's not in the ad. The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is not in those ads. Last Friday, in our last round, I had brought up the one with the 2 older male golfers, and we've since seen what I believe is the ad for the union, for the casting call, and they asked for white male non-union players, I guess. On a different note, I feel sorry for the children of these people that are in the ads, because apparently their kids have really messed up, and the parents who, I'm trying to figure out the age range here. Like, maybe you had kids, really, really late into life, but why are you still, trying to protect your kids? Is kind of a joke I've heard a lot of people make. So much for the pull up your bootstraps.
Right.
Whether or not this is a demographic that the Conservatives have lost, it's a demographic that I think stereotypically we believe that votes Conservative. And I don't ever remember in the last couple of elections the Conservatives needing to narrowcast or micro-target a demographic like this. And I think that's kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, well, Cheryl, one of the interesting transformations of who is supporting the Conservatives right now under Mr. Poilievre is that he has made it much younger, right? He's reached a lot of younger voters who have moved to him because of the issues around generational fairness and structural barriers to them having the lives that the golfers in that ad were able to have. But, this is now 3 ads in the stretch run that does not feature Pierre Poilievre. And it's such a fascinating contrast with the actual campaign itself, like the tour, because it's all about the leader, but then the bot media is not about the leader. There's no narrative amplification. There's a contrast kind of happening there.
Yeah, and I think it's two different groups of people. Like the people who love Pierre Poilievre enough to turn out at his rallies love Pierre Poilievre. Like there's no question about that. They're there for his energy, for his rhymes, for the idea of being in the room with a whole bunch of people who feel the same way. When they're talking about persuadable voters, which is who they need if they want to win in this election, if you look at Pierre's favorability throughout this campaign, his negatives have been so much higher than his positives across the board. When pollsters have asked people, how have your feelings changed about this leader over the last weeks, Mark Carney gets a net positive and Pierre Poilievre gets a net negative. And if you're a campaign looking at how to feature someone in your final ad, you're going to feature your party, not your leader, if your party's polling higher than your leader. And that's the case here.
Right. So Fred, I mean, we've talked about narrative a lot on this show since we started doing this Friday segment. I mean, when the ad is very different than the tour, is that a narrative problem, or is it good to broaden your narrative appeal? I mean, how do you view it as someone who ran a campaign?
Yeah, look, it's a bit of an issue with the narrative. It's a bit, they are trying to bring it back to affordability, and that's the issue. And that's what they're trying to get a group that maybe they're feeling isn't hit by affordability at the same level to understand that a lot of people are struggling, can't afford a home, and reach that demographic that it is important for the future of this country to vote Conservative to deal with these issues.
Okay, I have one last question for you, Fred. I want to go back to what you're saying about the end of the 2021 campaign. You thought the model had you ahead in seat counts, because Aaron O'Toole, you did win the popular vote over Justin Trudeau in 2021. But this was an election with COVID at the tail end, and there was a COVID outbreak in Alberta. Things got pretty bad for former Premier Jason Kenney back then. Is that what did you in? Like, is it that kind of an externality that's required at this stage to flip things, or could it feels like an ad campaign is not going to do it now with everyone watching hockey and 25% of the electorate having already voted. Does it take something like that to move it now?
Likely, yes, and that's what did it. It was COVID was spiking that last week, and then on Thursday night before the election, Jason Kenney announced a lockdown in Alberta, which just sent shockwaves across the country, and our tracking. If the election was the Monday previous, Aaron O'Toole would have won that election and been Prime Minister. But the way it was going, if the election was a week after what it was, Trudeau would have got a majority. So it was moving, it was volatile, and it would take something big probably to move where we're going right now.
Okay, we're going to take a look. Quickly, Cheryl, go ahead.
Can I tell you something? I'm just going to tell you a really fun story about polls moving dramatically in the last final days of a campaign. When I ran Saskatchewan last year, all the polls shifted 2 nights before the election. And if you watched really closely, they predicted a majority NDP government in Saskatchewan coming the next day. And as we said today, we do not have a majority NDP government in Saskatchewan. So sometimes those massive moves in the final days are not actually accurate.
Well, that's a good point to remember. But Carla Beck did make big gains, especially in the urban centers of Saskatchewan, right? So there was movement, and maybe it just got overstated. Who knows? But this is why we do the poll tracker. We want to smooth out any anomalies.